Welcome back to the haunted lore, where history's darkest moments meet the supernatural mysteries that refuse to stay buried. Today, we're traveling to a small Iowa town where an unspeakable crime over a century ago left scars that many believe still bleed today. On a warm June night in 1912, 8 people went to sleep in a modest white house on 508 East 2nd Street in Villisca, Iowa. By morning, all 8 would be dead, their lives brutally ended by an unknown killer wielding an axe. But death, it seems, was not the end of their story. The Villisca Axe Murder House has become one of America's most notorious haunted locations, where the boundary between historical tragedy and supernatural phenomenon grows thinner with each passing year. This is a story that demands we examine not just what happened on that horrific night, but why the echoes of that violence continue to resonate through the decades, drawing investigators, paranormal researchers, and the curious from around the world to a house that many believe holds its secrets as tightly in death as it did in life. What made Villisca, Iowa, the perfect setting for America's most enduring murder mystery? To understand the true horror of what happened in Villisca, we must first understand the town itself. In 1912, Villisca was the embodiment of small-town America, a tight-knit farming community of roughly 2,000 residents, where everyone knew their neighbors and violent crime was virtually unheard of. The town sat in the heart of Iowa's agricultural belt, surrounded by endless cornfields that created a sense of isolation from the outside world. The Moore family had deep roots in this community. Josiah Moore, known to friends as JB, was a successful businessman who managed the John Deere implement store. At 43, he had built a comfortable life for his family through hard work and shrewd business sense. His wife, Sarah, 39, was beloved in the community for her involvement in the Presbyterian Church and her warm, welcoming nature. Their 4 children, Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul, 5, were typical small-town kids who played in the neighborhood streets and attended the local school. The house at 508 East 2nd Street was modest but well-maintained, a 2-story white frame home that reflected the Moore family's middle-class status. It featured a parlor, dining room, and kitchen on the first floor, with 4 bedrooms upstairs. The home had electric lighting, still a relative luxury in rural Iowa, and was furnished with the solid, practical pieces typical of the era. What made Villisca particularly vulnerable to the tragedy that would unfold was its very innocence. Doors were rarely locked, neighbors trusted one another implicitly, and the idea that such savage violence could visit their peaceful community was literally unthinkable. This trust, this openness, would prove to be both the town's greatest strength and its most fatal weakness. The social fabric of Villisca was woven tight through church attendance, community events, and shared agricultural rhythms. Children played freely throughout the neighborhood, moving between houses as if the entire town were one extended family. It was exactly this sense of safety and community that would make the murders so shocking, so incomprehensible to residents who had never imagined such evil could walk among them. Who were the victims, and what events led them to their fatal night? The evening of June 9th, 1912, began as a celebration. The Moore children had participated in a Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, an annual event that brought the entire community together. Catherine and Boyd Moore had performed in the program, and the family was in high spirits as they prepared to head home. But the Moore family wouldn't be alone that night. 2 young guests would join them, a decision that would prove tragically fatal. Ina Stillinger, 8, and her sister Lena, 12, were daughters of a neighboring family. The girls often stayed overnight with friends, and on this particular evening, they were invited to spend the night with Catherine Moore, who was close friends with Lena. Josiah Moore was a man of routine and responsibility. He had built his reputation in Villisca through fair dealing and hard work, but like many small-town businessmen of the era, he was not without his controversies. Some historians have noted tensions within the business community, including a falling out with his brother-in-law over a business deal and disagreements with other local merchants. However, none of these disputes seemed serious enough to warrant the extreme violence that would follow. Sarah Moore was known throughout Villisca for her kindness and her dedication to her family and church. She was an active member of the Presbyterian congregation and often helped organize community events. Her children were well-behaved and popular among their peers, reflecting their mother's influence and their father's steady presence in their lives. The Stillinger sisters came from a similar background. Their parents, Ross and Sarah Stillinger, were hard-working members of the community who trusted their neighbors implicitly. Allowing their daughters to spend the night with the Moore family was a common occurrence, the kind of innocent sleepover that happened regularly in small towns across America. As the evening progressed, the family and their young guests settled into their normal routines. The children were put to bed, with Ina and Lena sharing the downstairs bedroom, while the Moore parents and their children occupied the upstairs bedrooms. By all accounts, it was a peaceful, ordinary night in a home filled with love and the simple contentment of family life. None of them could have imagined that a killer was already among them, or perhaps watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to commit one of the most heinous crimes in American history. What happened during those dark hours when evil visited East 2nd Street? The attack began sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. on June 10, 1912, though the exact timeline remains one of the many mysteries surrounding this case. What we know with certainty is that someone entered the Moore house and systematically murdered every person inside with an axe that belonged to Josiah Moore himself. The killer's approach suggests both planning and intimate knowledge of the house's layout. The murderer entered through an unlocked door, a common practice in Villisca, and moved through the home with deadly efficiency. Each victim was struck in the head while they slept, the attacks so swift and brutal that there was no evidence of struggle or defensive wounds. The crime scene revealed disturbing details that pointed to a killer who was either completely detached from reality or operating under some twisted methodology. After the murders were complete, the killer spent considerable time in the house, covering mirrors and windows with clothing and towels, as if trying to hide the carnage from unseen eyes. This behavior suggested either superstition, psychological breakdown, or a deliberate attempt to prevent identification. Perhaps most chilling was the evidence that the killer had remained in the house for some time after the murders. A plate of food was found partially eaten, and there were signs that the perpetrator had washed his hands and attempted to clean the murder weapon. The axe was found in the downstairs bedroom, leaning against the wall as if carefully placed there. The positioning of the bodies and the nature of the wounds indicated that the killer had struck each victim multiple times, far beyond what was necessary to cause death. This level of violence suggested either personal rage or a complete psychological break from reality. Some victims had received more than 20 blows, turning what might have been a quick death into something far more savage. The killer had also attempted to conceal evidence, placing sheets over the heads of several victims and rearranging the scene in ways that suggested ritualistic behavior. A bowl of water was found bloodied, indicating the murderer had attempted to wash, and a cigarette butt was discovered, though none of the Moore family smoked. When morning came, the house stood silent on East 2nd Street, its windows still covered, its doors still closed. But inside, the most horrific crime in Iowa's history had already been completed, leaving behind questions that would haunt investigators for more than a century. How did a quiet Sunday morning reveal the unthinkable? Mary Peckham lived next door to the Moore family and knew their daily routines as well as her own. When Sunday morning arrived and she saw no signs of activity from the Moore house, no children playing in the yard, no sounds of the family preparing for church, she became concerned. The Moores were faithful churchgoers who never missed Sunday service, and their absence was immediately noticeable in a community where such patterns were sacred. By mid-morning, Peckham's concern had grown into genuine worry. She had tried calling to the house and knocking on doors, but received no response. The covered windows that she could now see clearly were completely out of character for Sarah Moore, who took pride in her home's appearance. Something was very wrong. Peckham contacted Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, who lived nearby. Together, they approached the house and discovered that all the doors were locked, another unusual occurrence for the Moore family. Ross eventually found a way to enter through the back door, and what he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. The first body Ross encountered was that of Ina Stillinger in the downstairs bedroom. The sight was so horrific that he immediately backed out of the house and contacted the authorities. Within minutes, word spread through Villisca that something terrible had happened at the Moore house, and a crowd began to gather on East 2nd Street. The local sheriff and the town's doctor arrived to find all 8 victims dead, their bodies positioned in their beds as if they had been killed in their sleep. The systematic nature of the killings and the obvious planning involved immediately ruled out any possibility of a crime of passion or random violence. This was something far more sinister. As news of the murders spread, the tight-knit community of Villisca was thrown into a state of shock and terror that would never fully heal. In a town where violent crime was virtually unknown, the brutal murder of an entire family, including 4 children and 2 young guests, was beyond comprehension. The crime scene was unfortunately compromised from the beginning, as curious townspeople entered the house before proper investigative protocols could be established. This contamination of evidence would plague the investigation for years to come and contribute to the case remaining unsolved to this day. Why did the investigation become as twisted as the crime itself? The investigation into the Villisca murders began immediately, but was hampered from the start by the limitations of 1912 forensic science and the small-town nature of the local law enforcement. The Iowa Bureau of Investigation was called in, along with private detectives and even federal agents, but the crime scene had already been compromised by well-meaning townspeople and curious onlookers. Several suspects emerged over the months and years following the murders, but none could be definitively connected to the crime. The most prominent suspect was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher who had been in Villisca the night of the murders and had given a sermon at the Presbyterian Church earlier that evening. Kelly's behavior after the murders was considered suspicious. He left town quickly and seemed to have knowledge of details that hadn't been released to the public. Another suspect was Frank Jones, a local businessman who had been involved in a bitter dispute with Josiah Moore over business matters. Jones had the means and possibly the motive, and some evidence suggested he might have hired someone to kill Moore, though the brutal nature of the crime seemed to go far beyond a simple business revenge. The investigation was further complicated by the involvement of multiple law enforcement agencies, each pursuing their own theories and suspects. Private detectives hired by the state and by concerned citizens often worked at cross purposes, and information was not always shared effectively between agencies. Perhaps most frustrating was the abundance of false confessions and unreliable witnesses that emerged in the wake of the murders. The case attracted nationwide attention, and dozens of people came forward claiming to have knowledge of the crime or even responsibility for it. Sorting through these false leads consumed enormous amounts of investigative resources, while the real perpetrator remained free. The physical evidence, while extensive, was largely circumstantial. The murder weapon belonged to the Moore family, fingerprinting was in its infancy, and DNA analysis was decades away from being invented. Investigators had to rely on witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and the behavioral analysis techniques available at the time. 2 grand juries were convened and several arrests were made, but no charges were ever successfully prosecuted. The case officially remains unsolved, making it one of the oldest cold cases in American criminal history and leaving a legacy of unanswered questions that continues to fascinate researchers today. When did the dead begin to make their presence known? The transition from historical tragedy to supernatural legend didn't happen immediately. For decades after the murders, the house at 508 East 2nd Street stood as a grim reminder of that terrible night. But reports of paranormal activity were sporadic and often dismissed by a community trying to heal from its trauma. The first documented reports of unusual phenomena began in the 1940s, when new owners of the property started experiencing strange occurrences. Doors would open and close on their own, footsteps could be heard in empty rooms, and several residents reported the sounds of children's voices and laughter coming from areas where no children were present. As the decades passed, the reports became more frequent and more specific. Visitors to the house began reporting the sensation of being watched, sudden temperature drops in specific rooms, and the sound of an axe striking wood when no one was using tools anywhere nearby. These experiences seemed to center around the bedrooms where the murders had taken place, particularly the children's rooms upstairs. In the 1990s, paranormal investigators began taking serious interest in the property. The house had changed hands multiple times over the years, with several owners reporting that they couldn't live there due to disturbing experiences. Some reported waking up to find their children's toys had been moved or rearranged during the night, while others described the sensation of someone sitting on their bed or touching them while they slept. The most commonly reported phenomena involved the spirits of children. Visitors often described hearing the sounds of kids playing, running up and down the stairs, or calling out to each other. Some reported seeing small figures moving through the hallways or standing in doorways. These experiences were often accompanied by a sense of innocence and playfulness rather than malevolence, suggesting that the children's spirits remained unaware of their tragic fate. More disturbing were the reports related to the adult victims. Some visitors described feeling an overwhelming sense of dread in certain parts of the house, particularly in the master bedroom and the parlor. A few reported seeing the figure of a man in period clothing, sometimes described as wearing a suit and appearing agitated or angry. The most unsettling reports involved experiences that seemed to recreate elements of the crime itself. Several visitors have reported hearing the sound of heavy footsteps moving methodically through the house at night, following the same pattern investigators believe the killer used. Others have described waking up to find their mirrors covered, echoing the killer's strange behavior on the night of the murders. What do modern paranormal investigators discover when they spend a night in the house? Today, the Villisca Axe Murder House operates as a museum and overnight paranormal investigation site, allowing researchers and curious visitors to experience the location firsthand. The current owners have carefully restored the house to its 1912 appearance, using period furniture and artifacts to recreate the environment as it would have appeared on the night of the murders. Professional paranormal investigation teams have conducted hundreds of studies at the location using modern equipment, including electromagnetic field detectors, thermal imaging cameras, digital voice recorders, and motion sensors. The results have been remarkably consistent across different teams and time periods, suggesting that something unusual is indeed occurring at the location. Electronic voice phenomena, or EVP, recordings from the house have captured what appear to be voices of children calling out names, adults speaking in hushed tones, and occasionally what sounds like crying or distressed breathing. Some of the clearest recordings seem to feature children's voices saying "mama" or calling for their parents, consistent with the presence of the young victims. Temperature anomalies are frequently recorded throughout the house, with sudden drops of 10 to 15 degrees occurring in specific locations without any apparent natural cause. These cold spots often correspond to the locations where bodies were found, and they tend to occur even during warm weather when the house's heating and cooling systems can't account for the temperature variations. Motion detectors placed throughout the house regularly trigger without any visible cause, often in patterns that suggest someone moving through the rooms in a deliberate manner. Night vision cameras have captured unexplained shadows and light anomalies, though clear apparitions remain rare. Perhaps most intriguing are the reports from overnight visitors who have no prior knowledge of the case details. Many report dreams or visions that correspond remarkably closely to known facts about the murders, including details that were never made public. Some describe seeing the crime as if they were present, while others report conversations with the victims or encounters with a menacing figure carrying an axe. The psychological impact of spending time in the house is significant for many visitors. Even skeptics often report feeling uncomfortable, anxious, or depressed while inside, particularly in the bedrooms where the murders occurred. Some describe the sensation of being watched or followed, while others report feeling an overwhelming sadness that seems to permeate the entire structure. Why does this century-old crime continue to captivate and terrify us today? The enduring fascination with the Villisca Axe Murder House stems from the intersection of several powerful human fears and curiosities. At its core, this is a story about the violation of our most sacred spaces, the family home, the children's bedroom, the safety we assume in sleep. The randomness and brutality of the crime challenges our fundamental beliefs about justice, safety, and the ordered nature of society. The unsolved nature of the case adds another layer of compelling mystery. In an age where we expect crimes to be solved through scientific analysis and investigative technique, the Villisca murders represent a frustrating gap in our understanding. The killer walked away into history, leaving behind only questions and theories that have never been definitively answered. From a paranormal perspective, the house represents what researchers call a perfect storm for supernatural activity. The violent nature of the deaths, the fact that the victims were killed in their sleep and may not have understood what happened to them, and the ongoing attention and emotional energy focused on the location all contribute to conditions that paranormal theorists believe can sustain spiritual activity. The house also serves as a time capsule, preserved much as it was in 1912 and allowing visitors to step directly into the past. This temporal connection creates a powerful psychological experience that many find transformative, whether they believe in ghosts or not. The weight of history in that small Iowa home is palpable and moving. Modern media has played a significant role in keeping the Villisca story alive. Television shows, documentaries, books, and online discussions have introduced new generations to the mystery, each bringing their own perspectives and theories to a case that refuses to be closed. The internet age has allowed armchair detectives around the world to collaborate on solving the crime, ensuring that interest in the case continues to grow rather than fade. The house has also become a pilgrimage site of sorts for those interested in true crime, paranormal investigation, and American history. Thousands of visitors make the journey to rural Iowa each year, drawn by the combination of historical significance and supernatural reputation. For many, spending a night in the house becomes a transformative experience that stays with them long after they leave. Perhaps most importantly, the Villisca murders remind us that evil can appear anywhere, even in the most innocent and peaceful settings. The crime shattered the illusion of small-town safety and forced America to confront the possibility that monsters can hide among us, looking like ordinary neighbors and friends. As we conclude our journey into the darkness that visited Villisca, Iowa on that June night in 1912, we're left with more questions than answers. The identity of the killer may be lost to history, but the impact of that crime continues to ripple through time, touching everyone who encounters this story. The Villisca Axe Murder House stands today as more than just a historical site or paranormal hotspot. It's a monument to 8 innocent lives cut short, a reminder of mysteries that may never be solved, and perhaps, if the reports are true, a place where the boundary between our world and whatever comes after grows thin. Whether you believe the spirits of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters still walk those halls, or whether you see the house simply as a preserved piece of American criminal history, one thing remains certain. The events of June 10th, 1912, left scars on that small Iowa community that have never fully healed. Thank you for joining me for another episode of The Haunted Lore. If you found today's exploration into the Villisca Axe Murder House compelling, please subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review. Your support helps us continue investigating the places where history's darkest moments intersect with the supernatural mysteries that refuse to stay buried. Next week, we'll be exploring another location where tragedy and the paranormal intertwine in ways that challenge everything we think we know about life, death, and what lies beyond. This has been the Haunted Lore Podcast. Thank you for listening.